So this week we are looking at how logic works and how logic affects um, how we use language. And eventually we're going to take what we use today forward to think about how we create interpretations of texts in our close readings that follow logically from the observations we're making about the texts. Okay, so don't think about that right now. I'm going to circle back to that as time goes on. Today, I just want to take a step back and look from the bird's eye view at how logic works in itself, and then I'll make some comments as we go about various things that are more important to highlight that will have more direct application for us as writers practicing writing in this class. So first, let's think about the two forms of logic. There's two ways you can think, two different approaches to making a logical argument. The first is the deductive method, and the second is the inductive method. And these are completely different forms of reasoning. Deduction starts with a big principle. We call this the major premise or the theory. And then we apply that theory to different particular instances to figure out if something follows or fits within the definition and therefore has to have the application of that general concept applied to it. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Induction is just the opposite. We don't start with any big principles. We start with particular observations and we build toward a hypothesis about a general rule that results from the probability that that pattern will continue to be true in the world. So let's take a look at each of those more specifically. So here's deduction, and here's a deductive argument following a very classic looking deductive form called the syllogism, which we're going to look at in some detail here in this lesson. But here's what it looks like. I just want to look at it very briefly for a moment here and compare it to induction. So in deduction, when we have it all sorted out in its proper syllogistic form, its sort of formal structure, you'll see it always starts with what we call a major premise, a very big statement or a very general statement about the world. All men are mortal. That's the first premise of this argument. All men are mortal. This is Socrates, this is Plato's famous example of the syllogism, and you can see that in classical Greece we didn't have folks didn't care so much about gender neutral language, so we say all men instead of all men and women. But no matter, we'll go with the classical form here. All men are mortal. Of course, women too. What we mean really here is humans, right? The second statement is Socrates is a man. So this is a minor premise, and it's a specific case. We now are just talking about one individual, and we've put that individual in the class of things that are people or men. So now that we know that all men are mortal and Socrates belongs to that category of things, men, we can conclude that Socrates is mortal. And that's the conclusion. Those three dots you see on the left here, this is the classical logical, this is the formal logic symbol for therefore, or it follows that, right? It follows that Socrates is mortal. If these two statements are true, then it follows that Socrates is mortal. Now, what's really just happened here is a law of transitivity, or a law of transfer. We know that all of this category has this quality. We know that this person is part of that category, and so we're just connecting, we're just sort of stitching together these two statements to create a logical conclusion that follows from that. Okay? We'll say a couple more things specifically about this in a second, but let's flip over to an inductive argument, just so to show you, to compare and contrast deduction and induction. An inductive argument doesn't start with a big general statement like all men are mortal. It starts with a very particular instance, one event or one observation. Now, this is a kind of a humorous example of of a chicken, and this is an example from Bertrand Russell's Problem of Philosophy. A poor chicken, here he is. He recognizes, he experiences that his master has fed him today, and then he recognizes this pattern. This happens again the next day. He gets fed the day after that, and the day after that. And in the process of induction, in the logic of induction, that chicken rightfully starts to form a hypothesis that he will be fed the next day and indefinitely after that. He will feed me tomorrow. Of course, the joke here is on the chicken, because this is the humorous part of the example, because of course the farmer is just fattening up the chicken to eventually kill it and eat it. But the inductive reasoning is very sound. Induction works like this. We take small observations, we look at the pattern, and we realize they all add up to a probabilistic statement about about the pattern. We extrapolate the pattern into a general statement, right? So just to review, we went in deduction from a general statement about reality, all men are mortal, down to a specific case. In induction, we went from very specific cases to a general statement. And that's why this diagram of the two triangles shows that there's a kind of symmetry, a kind of mirroring of logic between the two systems. One goes down and the other goes up. Okay. Now, one of the differences, though, between deduction and induction is the nature of the conclusions we draw. We draw what we call necessary logical conclusions from deduction. When we have a deductive form that's valid, and I'll explain what that means in a second. When we have a valid formal deductive argument, the conclusion must follow. It's necessary. It has to follow. If all men are indeed mortal and Socrates is indeed a man, then it must be true. It's been necessarily true that he is mortal. Now, why is that? Because in the logic of deduction, we are really making statements about definitions and classes. What is it about men? What's a true statement about men that applies to all men? And what class of things does Socrates belong to? So if you think back to that classification work you did last week, you can now see some of the implications of how classification systems can produce logical thinking. If you know certain things go in certain categories, you know that the essential qualities of that category must apply to it. And that's why we call deductive logic a kind of logic that creates necessary conclusions. In inductive logic, we have a very different situation. We don't have, if you remember, we don't have the general statement. We don't have the general principle of life. We have to build towards it. So if you think about the Socrates example, we won't say that, let's throw the chicken out for a second. Socrates is a man, Plato is a man, I am a man, and all of those people die. I guess I shouldn't use myself because I wouldn't be able to observe that. Socrates dies and he's a man. Plato dies and he's a man. Your cousin dies and he was a man. And eventually you start to see, just like the chicken, that there's a pattern here. People die, right? They are mortal. So you form this general statement that extrapolates from the pattern. Well, that is great, but it doesn't have a necessity to it. It's only probable that the next person you meet will be a mortal person. And in fact, the sort of weakness of inductive reasoning is that all you need is one counterexample, one contrary or antithetical case to disprove your theory. So all we need is one person who isn't mortal to upend our observation. We just need to find one immortal person, and suddenly the premise that all men are mortal will no longer be true in inductive reasoning. We think that the next person who lives will be mortal. It's a very, very high chance. In fact, it's such a high chance, it's almost insane to think it's not true. But it is a probabilistic statement and not a necessary statement. Okay, that's not super important, but it is important. It is interesting, and it has certain ramifications. So just notice the difference between deductive and inductive, and notice the difference between the kinds of arguments that we can make based on them, necessary versus probable arguments. Okay, So let's go back to the syllogism. This is the form that we work in to create deductive arguments. And look at what the syllogism has in it. It has a major premise. This is the general statement. It's a universal claim. All men are mortal, or something like that. They're not all as big as that, but they're bigger than the next part. The next part is always a very specific, smaller version, a particular application of the first part. Socrates is a man. We call that the minor premise. So we have the big thing, that's the major premise. The minor premise is the specific application, and the conclusion is just connecting the two terms that are both in the major premise and the minor premise. Look back at the major premise. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. What term or concept appears in both of those statements? It's the concept of man. So that's called the middle term. And in the conclusion, in a syllogism, we just erase the middle term and connect the two remaining terms. Socrates is mortal. And that's a very useful thing to recognize about syllogisms, is if you recognize what the middle term is, in this case it's men, then we know that the conclusion has to have the other parts of the syllogism, not the middle term. Okay, that's a syllogism. Major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. The middle term is the term that shows up in both major and minor premise. The conclusion has the two remaining terms joined together. Okay, let's look at a couple syllogisms. No frogs are mammals. Kermit is a frog. Therefore, Kermit is not a mammal. Okay, now that is a good syllogism. It is taking a big statement, no frogs are mammals. It's finding a specific application. Kermit is a frog. And it's connecting the two terms that are not the middle terms. What's the term that shows up in both of these? Frogs, okay? So Kermit and mammal show up in the conclusion. Now it sounds a little different, and that's only because we have a negative statement. We are saying that no frogs are mammals. In the Socrates example, we said all men are mortal. So it still works the same way, but we're just making a different kind of observation. Nothing in this category is this kind of thing. All right? The next example, houses are good investments. John wants to make a good investment. So John should buy a house. All right? All houses are good investments. You can think about it that way. It doesn't use the phrase all, but that's kind of implied in parentheses invisibly here. All houses are good investments. And John wants to buy a good investment. That's the minor particular case. So we conclude that he should buy a house. Now what I'm going to show you, this is a very brief overview of logic. I'm not trying to I want you to memorize all these things or become an expert, but this is one of the things I really do want you to see. I've shown you all this to show you this. And this is a very fancy $10 word that you'll impress people with if you know what it is. It's called the enthymeme. The enthymeme. And what that simply means is the missing premise or the implied premise. So we remember that syllogisms have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, and it has three parts. Those are deductive syllogisms. Well, in the real world, we use deductive syllogisms all the time, but we don't put them in that formal structure of three parts, major, minor, premises, and conclusion. We don't do that. We don't need to do that because we've gotten so good as language users and as communicators and as rational creatures that we can make a kind of leap, a logical leap, to fill in the missing premise or premises. And so we actually don't talk in formal logical structures. We talk in enthymemes. And so what am I talking about? So I wouldn't go up to somebody and say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But I might say something like, Socrates is mortal because he's human. Okay, so in that sentence, I've captured two of the parts of the syllogism. If I go back, we can review what the original syllogism said. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. So I've I've got two of in my statement here, Socrates is mortal because he's human. I've kind of said in a slightly less formal way, two parts of them. Can you think about which two I'm using? Yeah, I'm using the second premise and the conclusion in that statement. I'm saying Socrates is a man, he's human. That's that part. And then I've also said Socrates is mortal. That's that part. That's actually the conclusion of the original syllogism. This is the second premise of the original second syllogism. So what's missing? I've implied, I've left out, I let the person I'm talking to fill in the missing part. All humans are mortal. I didn't say that. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Who needs to hear that part? I don't need to spell that out in a informal conversation with somebody. Socrates is a man because he's mortal. Makes perfect sense because we all know that humans are mortal. I didn't even need to bother with explicitly stating that general rule of life, right? Now, enthymemes are interesting because you can leave out any of the three parts of the three-part syllogism. You can leave out any three parts. Here we left out the major premise. Let's see what another one does. I'm going to the store because I need some milk. I'm going to the store because I need some milk. Okay. And I've written here the missing premise, the premise that was left out. The store has milk. All right. Or if you want to be formal about it, all stores have milk, right? Those two things go together. So notice that I left this out. Of course, the person listening to me knows the store has milk because that's where milk is. That's where you buy it, right? But I didn't spell that out. I just left that to the reader to figure out. One more. I'm going to the store for some milk. Now, here I've gone to another level. Instead of saying two of the three and leaving out one, I've only said one of the three and left out two. Right? I'm going to the store for some milk. Well, apparently he needed some milk. That's why he's going. And apparently the store has it. Make sense? And if you wanted to spell this out in the formal syllogistic form, it would look like this. The store has milk. I need some milk. So I'm going to the store, right? I didn't need to say those parts. This, in real life, works perfectly fine, but it does imply a couple of assumptions. And those assumptions are, the store has milk and I need some milk. Okay, let's look at another example of this. I'm going out to buy a car. This is imaginary, like, a couple, husband and wife perhaps. I'm going to buy a car. Whoa, shouldn't we discuss this first? Why? Because buying a car is a big decision. Okay, so this is a very brief conversation between two people. And what is this person arguing, the second person? You should discuss things with big decisions with me, right? This was an imply. She didn't say that. He or she didn't say that when she was arguing back. But it was clear in what she was implying by what she said. Buying a car is a big decision, right? Whoa, shouldn't we discuss this first? Buying a car is a big decision. The implied assumption is that you should always discuss big decisions, right? So if we paused their conversation and wrote this out as a deductive statement, a deductive argument, we would write, big decisions should be discussed. It's a general rule. People should follow that rule. It's common courtesy, right? In this specific case, buying a car is a big decision. Now, he wants to go out and buy a car, so this is a case in which the rule applies, right? We should discuss buying a car. Okay, this seems very basic. This should be pretty easy for you, but I want you to see what's happening in very common everyday language use. We're seeing how people infer, or I should say imply, certain assumed rules or principles of life. Certain assumptions, often the major premise, sometimes other parts. But enthymemes are how people actually use language, and you're eventually going to learn how to practice picking out when these assumptions are being made in a text, so you can observe and analyze the logic that they're using. All right, let's do another enthymeme or two. Christy is only human, so she's going to make mistakes. Okay, this is one for you to try. Christy is only human, so she's going to make mistakes. This has a missing premise or conclusion. One of the three parts are missing. Can you figure out which one is missing? There's two of them here. Christy is only human. She's going to make mistakes. Those are two separate parts of the syllogism. What's the last part? Yeah, it should be, you should have gotten something like, humans make mistakes. All humans make mistakes. Something like that would be the correct answer. So which part of the syllogism is that missing premise? Is it the major premise that states the general rule, the minor premise that states the specific application of the rule, or the conclusion? Yeah, you should have said major premise. All humans make mistakes. That is a major premise. It states the specific rule. That's the major premise, the first part of the syllogism. The bigger, let's go back. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. The burgers are better at Burger King. Okay, so this one is a humorous advertising kind of statement. Let's see what the logic is behind this theoretical advertising slogan. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. All right, that's one of the three parts of the syllogism. The burgers are better at Burger King. That's a second part of the syllogism. What's the missing statement? There's a third part in here that's being implied. Think about it. What's the missing part? Yeah, it should be the burgers are bigger at Burger King. We said here the burgers are better at Burger King, and we said that the bigger they are, the better they are. So what this statement is kind of implying is the King burgers are bigger. Now, they only imply that. They don't actually state that. So that's kind of interesting. Like, we could go out to Burger King and check it out. Is this actually true? They aren't actually promising that, right? And so this gets into what we'll be looking at in a second, is the rhetorical effect of enthymemes, how you can choose which part of the syllogism to leave out in order to get different effects, right? They didn't want to focus on how big the burgers were. They want you to just imagine they are big, because that's the way this statement acts on you, right? Okay, so then let's look at this one. This one leaves out two parts. So for this one, you have to imagine somebody just said, I got accepted to Princeton. And the person who's responding says, oh, only snobby people boast about their achievements. Okay, so there's one of the three. In enthymemes, you can actually leave out two of the three parts. So this one, like the example we saw earlier, leaves out two of the three parts. So what's missing here? Only snobby people boast about their achievements. We have a person who just did that. Her name is Jan, let's say. She just got accepted to Princeton. And then Sal says, only snobby people boast about their achievements. What is she saying? What is she implying? What is she assuming? There's two missing parts here. Okay, so something like the conclusion is easiest, right? Clearly Sal is saying that Jan is implying that Jan is a snobby person. So we know that the conclusion should probably be Jan is a snobby person. Okay, so that's the second part. What's the last part? Only snobby people boast about their achievements. Jan is a snobby person. So clearly Jan boasted about her achievements. And she's right, because Jan just did. What she's actually doing is interpreting what Jan just said. I got accepted to Princeton as a boast, right? So that's where we could probably argue back with Sal and say, well, don't be so ungracious to Jan. She's not being a snob. She's not really boasting. She's just reporting or something, right? That's an interpretive statement. What Sal is saying is that was a boast, and since only snobby people boast, Jan is a snob. Let's move on. Okay, so let's look at what I was just talking about, the rhetorical effect of leaving out different parts of a syllogism, right? When we say rhetorical effect, what we mean is the tone of what we're saying, the kind of feeling it creates in the person who's listening or reading, right? The implied the connotations, the implied aspects of it, right? So when you choose, or if you're reading an author who's choosing which part or parts to leave out of a syllogism, you can consider why they might be leaving out the parts they're leaving out. What different effects might that create, right? So here we have our Burger King syllogism here. Bigger is better. Burgers are Burger King are bigger, so the burgers are better at Burger King, right? Time to get your B's today. We're going to say lots of B's. All right, so we could put this syllogism in enthymemic form, in the enthymeme form, taking out one premise, in three different ways, right? If we just take out one premise, it gives us three different combinational options. We could take out the minor premise, right? The bigger the burger, the better the burger, major premise. And the conclusion, the burgers are better at Burger King. We looked at the minor premise. We could take out the conclusion and just have the major and the minor premise. Or we could just take out the major premise and write it like this. The burgers are better at Burger King. That's the conclusion. Because they are bigger. That's the minor premise, right? The burgers are bigger at Burger King. So here, what we haven't said is that the bigger, the better. We haven't actually stated the major premise. Yeah. Now you can ask yourself which of these sounds the most natural. Which one would you use in a conversation with somebody, like informally? You can ask which one sounds best for a advertisement, right? Which one sounds the least manipulative, the most manipulative, and those sorts of things, right? A very popular choice in regular speech is to leave out the major premise. Why? Because people, we know, we just have ingrained in us a lot of the basic things about life. People die, people are mortal. So-and-so, people are imperfect. So-and-so is a human being, so of course they're going to make mistakes. Of course, bigger is better. This is a kind of a cultural assumption. I chose this one as an interesting example because a lot of people would automatically assume bigger is better. But as we know, as we're getting better at understanding nutrition and bodily health, bigger, more quantity of something is not always a good thing. So this is a questionable assumption. Actually, it's this, the major premise. Bigger is better. That's a questionable assumption, but it is an argument. It is a theory about food, and you can make these kinds of claims using it. Now, let's see. Let's try that again, but this time, no, let's see. Let's look at one more example of how choosing which premise or premises to leave out creates different effects. What if you had this argument, right? Men who sound whiny are unattractive. You are sounding whiny right now, so you are unattractive right now. Again, in real life, you wouldn't spell it all out like that. You'd probably say it one of these ways. Men who are whiny are unattractive. You are whiny right now. Right? What does that make you feel like? That's probably like, oh, she's trying to be nice to me. She's I'm assuming this is a guy and a girl, right? She's trying to just imply that she thinks I'm unattractive. That's kind of a nice way of putting it, even though it hurts, right? You sound whiny right now. It's unattractive, right? Now this one is more direct. It's just naming what she's feeling and why, and I can figure out what she's leaving out is that it's not attractive to be whiny, and that makes sense. So this one is kind of like direct and very logical. It feels very logical to me, at least. Now, what if you said just one? This one just says the major premise. Men who sound whiny are unattractive. It just says it. And that person can make, if you're the boyfriend or the husband, you can make the inference yourself. Oh my gosh, I guess I'm whining right now, and that's unattractive to her. And this one is just the conclusion and leaves out both the major and the minor premise. This one is the most elusive or vague because it doesn't name why he sounds unattractive. He might be able to figure out from context that it's because he's whining, but if he's not recognizing himself as whining, he might miss the hint, right? You are unattractive right now. Maybe it's because he thinks that she's perceiving him as yelling, or maybe because what he's wearing. So she's not naming it. So this one could be misunderstood. But the point here is, in her head, she might be thinking this, but she's only saying this. Okay? So these are just various examples of how deductive logic works in kind of real world situations in the form of enthymemes. And now I just want to wrap up this lesson by pointing out the difference between two ways of talking about how a argument can be right or wrong. We have to distinguish between what we call validity and soundness, because an argument can be logically true according to its structure, but not be true in the real world, in real life, right? So what we use to discuss structural integrity of an argument, or the logical validity of an argument, we use the term valid, validity, right? That just means that the syllogism is set up correctly. It's not an invalid syllogism. The soundness, we can say that an argument is unsound or sound by saying that, well, this syllogism looks right, but in the real world, these premises are not true. Here's what I mean. You can say bigger burger, better burger, burgers are better at Burger King, but then you can go out and test the claim that bigger burgers are better, specifically that bigger burgers are always better. And that, if you are a nutritionist, you can think of a lot of ways in which that might not be true in the real world. So we can say that the argument, the syllogism is valid. It is correctly set up as a deductive argument, but it's not true in the real world. It's not sound. So something can be valid but not sound. And conversely, some of the premises of an argument can be true in the real world. They can be sound without the argument itself being valid. So bigger burgers are better, not sound. Here's an example of something that we might say is sound. Regular dentist visits usually relate to better dental health. The more you go, the more likely it is that you're healthy. That's probably true in the real world. So we have to distinguish and remember, we're not claiming necessarily that the premises are true or not true when we're talking about the internal logic of an argument, or the way that an argument is set up in its syllogistic or inductive form. We're just talking about its validity in that case, and then we can just separately talk about its soundness. So what do I mean by setting up the syllogism correctly? Well, it turns out that you can accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, to be mean and to cheat, you can set up a syllogism to be incorrect in the way that its terms relate to each other. Right? Now let's review and try to diagram what's going on in a correctly set up syllogism. This syllogism, oops, let me get rid of this unnecessary, that's incorrect. Let's just look at the or a prototype here. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. Right? If we take those terms and we plot those terms as a series of circles that show how the categories relate to each other, we can see that this looks valid, it looks true. In the major premise, we have two terms, men and mortal. And what we're saying, if you think about it in terms of categories depicted as circles, what we're saying here is that in the category of things that are mortal belongs the entire category of men. All men fit inside this bigger characteristic of mortality, right? So somewhere inside, this is just a made-up concept, right? Or this doesn't really exist in the real world, but we know that there are a number of mortal things, and this major premise claims that all men who exist, are part of that larger category of things that are mortal. So the small circle men is in the big circle mortal things, right? That's what the major premise is claiming here. Then the specific case is Socrates as a man. So Socrates, where does he show up in this diagram? Well, if he's in the man circle, he's necessarily, because we know the small circle is in the big circle, we know that he can be anywhere in here. He's just one man. He's somewhere in here. But he's therefore got to be in the big circle too, because the small circle is entirely included, is circumscribed by the big circle. All right, so this shows a valid syllogism. The details of this, again, I do not need you to remember or memorize. I'm just showing you an overview of logic here to help you think about how logic works so that you can apply this to your writing in more practical ways later. But I think it's helpful to see this so that you understand what's going on in a logical argument, just so you know it and can and make some good conclusions of your own when you use it later in writing. Okay, so this is a valid syllogism. Let's look at an invalid syllogism. If we follow the same approach, we can see that you can accidentally set up the syllogism in an incorrect way, right? All T is liquid. Like the previous example, we're just going to put the first term inside the second term. All the T, that's this circle, must belong to the larger circle of things that are liquid, right? Makes sense. We know in real world it is classifiable. We can put T inside of the category of liquid. That is the way things are because T is always a liquid beverage. Fine. But here's where we now run into trouble. The minor premise, the specific instance that we're applying here, is that my soda is liquid. Now, where in our circle do we want to put this? We could put it in here, but we don't have to, because what it's saying is that soda is liquid. Well, here's the liquid circle, the big one. So let's put it out here just because we can. It could be out here. We might get lucky. It might actually be also a T, but what we're trying to figure out is it guaranteed that it's got to be in here? No, it's not guaranteed at all. And actually, it's very probable that it's going to be outside of the circle because there's a lot more of the circle out here than in here. So let's put the my soda in here. This is technically following correctly what this minor premise claims. My soda is a liquid. This demonstrates that is accurately depicting this. So now that we've accurately depicted the major premise, T is inside of liquid, and the minor premise, soda is inside of liquid, we can ask, is it necessarily true that your soda is a T? Well, no. Here's the soda, here's the T. They're not overlapping. They're different. They're two different kinds of liquids, and clearly this syllogism is invalid. It wasn't set up correctly, right? This is true. This is sound. This is true in the sense of being sound in the real world. This is also sound. But the three together do not build up to a logically, the conclusion does not logically follow from the premises. Okay, so this is an invalid syllogism. Even though it's, well, these first two parts are sound. This part is clearly not sound. Your soda is not a T. Do one on your own. Let's see if you can figure this out. Let's go back to the Princeton example. If we write this out as syllogisms, then we might get something like this. All snobs are boastful. Jan boasts, thus Jan is a snob. Okay, now let's see if you can figure out if this is a valid or invalid syllogism. So what you need to do is you need to put the label, the diagram, according to the way that the premises are structured. So first, put the term snobs and the term boastful on this diagram, and then thirdly, put Jan on the diagram as the third term. Put Jan on the diagram based on where she where she goes or possibly can go according to the second statement. So first you're going to label snobs and boastful. I'll give you a hint. Snobs and boastful have to go on one of these two. They are the two circles. One of them is the small circle and one of them is the big circle. So figure out which one is which. And then put Jan anywhere you want to that follows the statement Jan boasts. Okay, I'll pause here and then I'll show you the answer I came up with in a second. Okay, so here's what I came up with. All snobs are boastful, so the first term belongs to the second term. Snobs should be the small circle and boastful is the larger circle. Okay, all snobs are boastful. That means there are some boastful people that are not snobs, and that might be the case for Jan. She boasted, that was the minor premise. And so I put her outside the snob circle because that is not what the minor premise says. It just says she boasts, does not say she's a snob necessarily, just that she boasts. So I put her outside the snob circle, but inside the boastful circle. And this shows me, when I look at the final statement, that this is not true. Jan is a snob? No, not true. She's just boastful, not necessarily also a snob. So this is an invalid syllogism. And that is the conclusion of this lesson. I have shown you here what valid and invalid, inductive and deductive reasoning, how it works. I've discussed the syllogism, how it has three parts, and I've compared that to the inductive process where we take lots of small examples to build to a general conclusion. We looked at some various ways that you can remove parts of syllogisms in what's called the enthymeme to get different real-world statements or deductive statements about things. And we looked at the validity and the soundness of different statements and considered how validity works as an internal structural quality of deductive arguments.